Welcome to History Teller YT, the channel where forgotten stories come alive. Today, we embark on an extraordinary journey through the untold history of the Subanen Tribes, the ancient guardians of the Zamboanga Peninsula. For centuries, they called themselves the gbansa Subanon, the Subanen Nation, rooted in rivers, mountains, and sacred forests. They endured colonization by the Spanish, disruptions under the Americans, and the struggles of the modern Philippine Republic. They faced land loss, mining, militarization, and prejudice. But through it all, they preserved their identity, their rituals, and their vision of harmony with nature and the unseen world. In this series, we will uncover their way of life, how they built homes on mountain ridges, how they cultivated rice with rituals of thanksgiving, how their leaders, the Timuay, upheld justice through custom law, and how the sacred Buklog festival connected humans with the spirits of the earth. We will explore their struggles for ancestral domain, their resilience under martial law, their fight against mining, and their dreams for the future. This is not just the story of one tribe. It is the story of survival, resilience, and cultural pride in the face of centuries of change. By the end of this journey, you will see why the Subanen are not just a people of the past, but voices for the future, guardians of land, identity, and life itself. Stay with me till the end, because once you hear their story, you will never look at history the same way again. The Subanen people, often proudly referring to themselves collectively as the gbansa Subanon or the Subanen Nation, trace their roots to a deep sense of connection with land, water, and ancestry. This idea of gbansa is not simply a political label, but rather a cultural fabric that binds communities together across rivers, mountains, valleys, and coastal areas of the Zamboanga Peninsula in western Mindanao. The Subanen identity is strongly tied to geography. In fact, within the wider Subanen Nation, individuals distinguish themselves from one another by reference to the specific landscapes where they or their ancestors lived, whether it is the banks of a river, the slopes of a mountain, or the shores of a lake. These natural landmarks are not only markers of origin, but also of cultural memory, since migration, farming, and even spirituality are rooted in them. Traditionally, Subanen society was semi-nomadic in practice, with families often moving from one area to another in order to clear fresh forest land for cultivation. Their subsistence lifestyle revolved around rice as the central crop, which they regarded as both a staple food and a cultural symbol of survival. Alongside rice, they cultivated root crops, corn, and vegetables, while also raising animals such as pigs, chickens, cattle, and water buffalo. Farming required mobility, as soil fertility declined over time, leading communities to search for new areas where forests could be opened into fields. Yet despite the constant movement, their sense of identity remained stable because the Subanen always anchored themselves to nature. Housing reflected this closeness to the land. Subanen dwellings were usually built along ridges and hillsides that overlooked family fields, enabling people to live in sight of the soil that sustained them. These houses were rectangular in form, elevated on stilts to avoid moisture and pests, and covered with thatched roofs of nipa or kogon grass. The stilts also created shaded space beneath the house, which served as storage or a cool area for livestock. Such architectural style signaled resilience and adaptation to the hilly environment of the peninsula. In this way, the Subanen early lifestyle demonstrates how geography shaped both their identity and their daily practices. The existence of the Subanen is well documented by both early Spanish chroniclers and later Western scholars. Ferdinand Blumentritt, a close friend and collaborator of Philippine national hero Jose Rizal, referred to the Subanos as a distinct people of Malay extraction. He described them as inhabiting nearly the entire Timuay Peninsula in western Mindanao, with the exception of a narrow strip along the south coast. His observations highlighted both their large territorial spread and their perceived cultural difference from coastal Muslim groups and Visayan settlers. Later, during the early 1900s, John P. Finley, an American ethnographer working under the colonial administration, revisited older Spanish records to provide a systematic description of the Subanen people. Finley drew upon the writings of Father Francisco Combs, a Jesuit missionary who in 1667 wrote extensively about Mindanao and its inhabitants. Combs considered the Subanen as among the true indigenous peoples of western Mindanao, predating the arrival of both Islam and Christianity. This portrayal framed them as custodians of the land and as an ethnic community whose roots were deeply embedded long before external influences altered the cultural map of the Philippines. While Spanish chroniclers often referred to the Subanen in terms colored by missionary concerns, viewing them as heathen because they practiced animism, anthropologists of the American colonial period recognized their complex social organization, their linguistic unity, and their adaptability to changing conditions. The label Subano, or Subanen, was sometimes misunderstood by outsiders, who used it loosely. Yet for the people themselves, it carried profound meaning. To be Subanon was to belong to the rivers. Suba in many Philippine languages means river, mountains, and ancestral spaces that define both livelihood and identity. Thus, even through centuries of colonial contact, the Subanen retained their sense of continuity and belonging to their homeland. As the centuries progressed, the Subanen community diversified into subgroups based on both geographic settlement and religious influence. Those who remained adherents of traditional animist beliefs called themselves simply Subanen, especially in areas near Zamboanga City and the interior valleys of the peninsula. Their religion emphasized rituals of thanksgiving, agricultural ceremonies, and reverence for ancestral spirits. These practices sustained their worldview, binding people to land and kin through ceremonies held in sacred groves or by riversides. In contrast, some Subanen groups came under the influence of Islam due to proximity and trade with Moro communities along the coast. These groups eventually became known as the Calabugan in the central part of the peninsula and the Calibugan in the western areas. Despite outside claims that the Calibugan or Calabugan were of mixed descent, allegedly intermarried with Samal, Tazig, Bajeo, or Maguindanan, linguistic evidence demonstrates that they are Subanen at their core. Their language remains virtually identical to that of non-Islamic Subanen groups, except for the presence of additional Arabic vocabulary related to religion. This shows that the shift was more cultural and religious than ethnic. The diversity of Subanen subgroups demonstrates the adaptability of the people in different contexts. While outsiders lumped all Muslim Subanen under the label Calabugan, internally they preserved their Subanen identity, only modifying religious practices while retaining their ancestral language and social ties. This blending of continuity and change would become a central theme in their history, showing that the Subanen identity could survive transformation and maintain coherence despite pressures from colonizers, missionaries, and neighboring groups. Thus, from the beginning, the Subanen story was one of resilience, adaptation, and cultural rootedness. The Zamboanga Peninsula, shaped like a crooked finger extending westward into the Sulu Sea, forms the geographic heart of the Subanen Nation. This landmass, more than 200 kilometers long, is joined to the main body of Mindanao through the narrow isthmus of Tacuran, which separates the bays of Aligon and Alana. Beyond this natural passage lies the main region of what later came to be called Muslim Mindanao, comprising the provinces of Lanao del Norte, Lanao del Sur, Maguindanao, Sultan Kudarat, and the twin Cotabato provinces. Within this larger Mindanao landscape, the Zamboanga Peninsula served as both a refuge and an ancestral domain for the Subanen, who occupied its rugged terrain, forest valleys, and coastal strips. The peninsula is today divided into 4 provinces: Zamboanga del Norte, Zamboanga del Sur, Zamboanga Sibigay, and Misamis Occidental. Historically, however, the entire region was recognized by both Spanish and American colonizers as Subanen territory. From the coastal settlements near Dapitan and Buklog to the inland valleys of Sindangan Bay, from the rugged areas of Sayakon and Kapit to the fertile slopes of Labangan and Damankalas Bay, Subanen presence was constant. Even in Misamis Occidental, particularly along the provincial boundary with Zamboanga del Sur, Subanen communities thrived in upland areas. This widespread presence gave the Subanen a strong claim to the land as their ancestral homeland. Geography was not just a backdrop for the Subanen way of life. It directly influenced settlement patterns, mobility, and cultural practices. Families built homes along ridges and hillsides, not only for security from flooding, but also for the vantage point it provided over agricultural fields. Rivers, with their rich alluvial soil, became lifelines for planting rice and root crops, while forest clearings provided hunting grounds and new land for shifting cultivation. In this way, the peninsula's geography shaped the Subanen into a people who were simultaneously farmers, foragers, and forest stewards. The land was not merely occupied, it was intimately known, celebrated, and preserved in oral tradition. Thus, the very landscape of Zamboanga became a living archive of Subanen memory. The architecture of Subanen dwellings offers deep insight into their adaptive lifestyle and spiritual relationship with the environment. A typical Subanen house was rectangular, elevated on stilts, and roofed with thatch made from nipa palm or kogon grass. The elevation was practical, protecting families from damp soil, termites, snakes, and seasonal flooding. The space beneath the house was not wasted. It was used as a shelter for pigs and chickens, a place to store farm tools, and sometimes even as a shaded resting area during the hottest hours of the day. Positioning was equally important. Subanen homes were usually located on slopes or ridges overlooking the fields. This choice allowed families to monitor their crops while living in safe, breezy areas away from stagnant water where mosquitoes bred. The view itself became part of their daily rhythm, reinforcing a sense of ownership and belonging to the land. Houses were built with local materials sourced from nearby forests. Bamboo for flooring, rattan for bindings, hardwood posts for stilts, and palm leaves for roofing. The construction style reflected communal labor, where neighbors and kin assisted in building or repairing homes. This tradition of mutual help, or pinakasi, was an important part of Subanen culture, ensuring that no family was left vulnerable. Beyond practicality, housing carried symbolic meaning. The stilts were not only functional, but also represented elevation above the ground world where spirits roamed. Many Subanen believed that malevolent forces lingered in forests and rivers. Raising the house symbolized both protection and respect for unseen beings. Certain rituals were performed during construction, such as offerings of food or betel nut to appease spirits and ancestors. These practices highlighted how deeply intertwined the material and spiritual worlds were in Subanen society. A house was not simply a shelter, but a sacred space of family continuity, woven with both physical labor and spiritual observance. The Subanen were never a small, isolated group. In fact, early estimates from colonial records already recognized them as one of the most numerous indigenous communities of Mindanao. In 1912, Official figures place the Subanen population at approximately 47,164. By the late 20th century, specifically in 1988, this number had grown to around 300,000. Such demographic expansion indicates not only natural population growth, but also the resilience of the community in maintaining its distinct identity despite centuries of contact with outsiders. Population growth and movement were directly tied to agricultural practices. Because the Subanen frequently cleared forest land for rice fields and then moved on once fertility declined, their settlements shifted periodically. This created a patchwork pattern of villages spread across the peninsula, linked by kinship networks and trade routes. While outsiders might have viewed this movement as instability, for the Subanen, it was a sustainable adaptation to the ecological conditions of upland Mindanao. By rotating areas of cultivation, they allowed forests to regenerate and ensured long-term survival. The expansion of the Subanen also brought them into contact with neighboring communities, both indigenous and Muslim. While the coast became dominated by Moro sultanates and later by Visayan settlers under Spanish encouragement, the Subanen largely maintained their hold on interior valleys and uplands. Nevertheless, interaction was inevitable. Trade in forest products such as rattan, beeswax, and resins connected Subanen villages to coastal markets, while intermarriage occasionally bridged cultural divides. Yet even with these exchanges, the Subanen retained a strong sense of who they were. Their identity as gbansa Subanon remained constant, defined not by political boundaries, but by ancestral relationship to the land. Language lies at the core of Subanen identity. Collectively referred to as Subanon, their language belongs to the wider Austronesian family, and specifically to the subgroup of Mindanao languages. It has many dialectal variations, which reflect the wide geographic spread of the people across the Zamboanga Peninsula. Communities living in Dapitan, Dipolog, and Manukan speak slightly different forms compared to those in Sindangan Bay, Sayakon, or Demancalis. Yet despite differences in pronunciation, vocabulary, and intonation, these dialects remain mutually intelligible, preserving the linguistic unity of the Subanen Nation. Contact with outsiders, however, left linguistic traces. Centuries of trade with Visayan merchants introduced Visayan loanwords into Subanen vocabulary, especially terms related to commerce, seafaring, and domestic life. Moro influence likewise introduced a layer of vocabulary linked to governance, religion, and ritual, particularly in areas where Subanen communities had regular contact with Muslim sultanates. For the Calibigan and Calabugan subgroups who adopted Islam, Arabic terms entered their speech, but the structure and grammar of Subanen remained intact. Linguistically, they continued to be Subanen even while shifting religious identity. This highlights how language functioned as a deeper marker of ethnicity than religion itself. The resilience of Subanen language reflects their social strategies. In spite of migration, pressure from dominant groups, and later exposure to Christianity and modern education, they retained their native tongue. Elders often passed on not just words, but entire repertoires of oral history, chants, and ritual formulae that reinforced cultural continuity. For the Subanen, speaking Subanen was more than communication. It was an affirmation of belonging to the gbansa Subanon. Each word carried echoes of rivers, mountains, and ancestral spirits. Even today, where Visayan or Tagalog may dominate in towns, the Subanen language survives as a living heritage in upland villages. The Subanen people developed an extraordinarily rich oral tradition that served as both entertainment and social memory. Without written scripts, knowledge was preserved through songs, chants, and stories handed down from generation to generation. Among the most important forms were epics that narrated the adventures of ancestral heroes, the struggles between good and evil, and the cosmic balance maintained by spirits. These epics were often performed during gatherings, rituals, or celebrations, accompanied by instruments like the colonization, a set of small gongs, and a gong, large gongs. One of the key features of Subanen oral tradition is its integration of myth and history. Stories of creation link the origins of rivers and mountains to divine acts, while genealogical tales connect present families to legendary ancestors. Myths explain why certain animals possess their traits, why rituals must be performed at harvest, or why taboos should not be broken. Such narratives are not only spiritual guides, but also moral lessons embedded in collective memory. For instance, stories warn against greed, arrogance, or neglect of ritual duties, teaching younger generations about the dangers of disrupting harmony with nature and spirits. Epic chanting, often performed by specially trained chanters, could last for hours or even days. These performances were not only art, but also community events where identity was renewed. The rhythm of the chant, the repetition of ancestral names, and the invocation of deities all served to situate the listeners within a continuum of past, present, and future. Through oral tradition, the Subanen ensured that even in the absence of formal writing, their worldview, history, and values were preserved intact. Oral tradition functioned as both literature and archive, guarding the essence of their cultural identity across centuries of change. Beyond language and storytelling, the Subanen developed vibrant forms of music, dance, and artistry that embodied their worldview. Musical expression often centered on gongs, flutes, and bamboo instruments. The Kolentangan ensemble, made up of horizontally laid gongs, played melodies during rituals and festivities, while the deep resonance of the agong provided rhythm and solemnity. These instruments were more than entertainment. They were tools of communication with the spirit world. Certain beats and sequences were believed to call ancestral spirits or deities to witness rituals, especially agricultural rites or healing ceremonies. Dance accompanied both ritual and celebration. Subanen dances often imitated natural movements, swaying like rice stalks, stepping like hunters, or circling like birds. Some dances were performed during Thanksgiving feasts to mark the end of planting or harvest, while others accompanied weddings, healing sessions, or peace agreements. In these dances, costume and ornamentation played an important role. Beaded accessories, woven textiles, and brass ornaments expressed both beauty and status. The use of bright colors symbolized vitality, prosperity, and spiritual energy. Artistic expression extended into crafts as well. The Subanen were skilled weavers and metalworkers, producing mats, baskets, and brass jewelry. These items were not only utilitarian, but also symbolic, often carrying motifs of nature, such as flowing rivers, leaves, or animal figures. Through design, they inscribed their environment into their material culture. Every piece of art, whether a song, a dance, or a crafted object, reinforced a worldview where human life was inseparable from nature, ancestry, and spirituality. Artistic expression, therefore, became a central mode of sustaining identity. It was a language of its own, resonating with meanings that could not be captured by ordinary speech. At the heart of Subanen society lies the family, which forms the foundation of kinship, community life, and cultural continuity. Unlike highly centralized polities, the Subanen historically maintained a decentralized structure where kinship networks provided the strongest bonds. A Subanen household extended beyond the nuclear family to include close relatives, a phenal kin, and even ritual kin formed through ceremonial relationships. This wide network of obligations ensured that no family stood alone. Mutual aid was expected in farming, house construction, ritual performance, and even in times of conflict. Marriage was a central institution that reinforced these kinship ties. Traditional Subanen marriages were not merely unions between individuals, but alliances between families. Negotiations often involved elders from both sides, who discussed bride price arrangements, agricultural support, and the responsibilities of the couple. Ceremonial exchanges of goods, such as rice, livestock, and brass ornaments, symbolized the fusion of households. Once married, couples often lived near the husband's kin, creating clusters of related families that could work together in farming and rituals. However, flexibility was also common, and residence could shift depending on economic opportunities or the influence of maternal relatives. Children were raised not only by their parents, but by the wider community. Elders played a significant role in transmitting oral traditions, songs, and moral lessons. This intergenerational teaching was vital for the preservation of Subanen culture. Discipline was generally mild, focusing on guidance rather than harsh punishment, since community harmony was highly valued. Kinship obligations extended beyond everyday life into the spiritual sphere as families collectively maintained ancestral rituals, offerings, and ceremonies. In this way, kinship and family were not just social units, but cultural institutions, embodying the Subanen worldview that individual life was inseparable from the collective. While the Subanen lacked a centralized political system akin to kingdoms or sultanates, they developed a form of leadership rooted in moral authority, wisdom, and community trust. The leader of a Subanen community was known as the Timuay. Unlike hereditary monarchs, the Timuay's authority was based on personal qualities, knowledge of custom law, gukom, skill in conflict resolution, and the ability to mediate between the human community and the spirit world. A Timuay was often an elder chosen for their reputation for fairness and their mastery of oral tradition, which served as the legal code of the people. The responsibilities of a Timuay were extensive. They presided over disputes involving land boundaries, marriage arrangements, theft, or interpersonal conflict. Their judgments were expected to restore harmony rather than punish harshly, reflecting the Subanen ideal of social balance. Compensation, reconciliation, and ritual cleansing were more valued than retribution. In addition, the Timuay organized community rituals, especially agricultural ceremonies, to ensure bountiful harvests. As mediators with the spiritual realm, they performed or supervised sacrifices, offerings, and chants that maintained cosmic harmony. The Timuay's role extended to intercommunity relations. In times of conflict between villages, they negotiated peace pacts or led delegations to allied groups. They also represented the community in dealings with external powers, including Spanish missionaries, Moro leaders, or later American officials. Through their leadership, the Subanen demonstrated a political system that was decentralized yet cohesive, grounded in custom rather than coercion. This flexible but respected form of governance allowed the Subanen to maintain autonomy across centuries, even as more centralized polities surrounded them. Although the Subanen emphasized equality and kinship, their society was not entirely without hierarchy. Leadership roles, such as the Timuay, created a form of status differentiation, but it was not absolute. Authority was tied to service, and a Timuay who failed to maintain fairness could lose respect. Wealth also played a role in status, particularly through ownership of livestock, rice fields, or brass heirlooms. But redistribution through rituals and feasts ensured that wealth served communal purposes. Feasts known as Buklog were particularly important, as they required substantial resources but brought prestige to to hosts who could feed and entertain entire communities. Gender roles in Subanen society were complementary rather than strictly hierarchical. Men often cleared forests, hunted, and defended the community, while women were central to rice cultivation, weaving, and maintaining household stability. Women also played crucial roles in rituals, especially in chanting, singing, and preparing offerings. In some traditions, women were recognized as ritual specialists, mediating with spirits during healing ceremonies. Thus, while men frequently occupied positions of public authority, such as Timuay, women exercised considerable influence within the spiritual and domestic spheres. Communal values emphasized harmony, reciprocity, and respect for elders. The concept of Maratabat, a sense of honor and dignity, guided behavior, ensuring that individuals upheld family reputation and avoided shameful conduct. Disputes were resolved through dialogue and restitution, with the aim of restoring relationships rather than deepening divisions. This moral code reinforced unity in a society that depended heavily on cooperation for survival. In essence, Subanen's social organization was both egalitarian and hierarchical, spiritual and practical, flexible yet deeply rooted in tradition. It reflected the broader philosophy of the Subanen, that life was about maintaining balance between humans, nature, spirits, and the wider cosmos. Before the arrival of Islam and Christianity, the Subanen worldview was deeply rooted in animism, a belief system in which nature and the spiritual world were inseparable. For the Subanen, rivers, forests, mountains, and even large trees were alive with spirits. These spirits, known as Dawada or Magbabea, held power over human destiny, agriculture, health, and community life. Every act of cultivation, from clearing a new field to planting rice, was accompanied by rituals to seek permission and blessing from unseen beings. Neglecting these rites could invite misfortune, crop failure, or illness. The Subanen viewed the cosmos as layered and interconnected. The physical world of humans existed side by side with the unseen world of spirits and ancestors. Ancestral spirits were particularly important, as they were believed to continue watching over their descendants. Families offered food, betel nut, and prayers at designated ritual sites to maintain harmony with their forebears. In this way, religion was not a separate domain, but woven into everyday life. Farming, hunting, childbirth, and healing all required spiritual acknowledgement. Ritual specialists, often known as shamans or Balian, played a crucial role in mediating between the human and spiritual realms. They performed chants, sacrifices, and healing ceremonies to restore balance when sickness or conflict arose. These specialists were respected figures, often inheriting their roles through family lines or being chosen through visions and dreams. Their knowledge of chants, ritual formulas, and offerings was vast, preserved orally and passed down through apprenticeships. In many ways, the Subanen religious system was an integrated worldview where spirituality, ecology, and society were inseparable threads of existence. Among the Subanen's many rituals, the Buklog stands out as the grandest and most significant. The Buklog is both a Thanksgiving festival and a ritual of cosmic renewal. It involves the construction of a massive wooden platform, raised above the ground and supported by a post driven deep into the earth. Participants gather on this platform, stomping rhythmically to create vibrations believed to awaken ancestral spirits and communicate with the unseen world. The sound of the stomping, combined with the resonance of gongs and chants, transforms the ritual space into a sacred bridge between humans and spirits. The Buklog is not merely a spectacle, but a deeply symbolic act. It expresses gratitude for blessings such as good harvests, recovery from illness, or survival from calamities. It also reaffirms communal solidarity, as hosting a Buklog requires immense resources: food, animals for sacrifice, and days of preparation. Families who sponsor the event gain prestige, but the benefits extend to the whole community, which comes together in feasting, dancing, and ritual observance. Elders lead the ceremonies, offering prayers and sacrifices, while ritual specialists recite chants invoking the protection of spirits and ancestors. Other rituals complemented the Buklog. Agricultural rites marked the cycles of planting and harvest. Healing ceremonies sought to remove illness-causing spirits from afflicted individuals. Marriage and childbirth involved blessings to ensure fertility and harmony. Even death was accompanied by complex rites, with offerings to guide the spirit of the deceased into the ancestral realm. Through these ceremonies, the Subanen continually renewed their relationship with the divine and natural worlds. Ritual life thus sustained not only spiritual balance, but also cultural cohesion, reinforcing identity across generations. The religious history of the Subanen cannot be understood without considering their encounters with Islam and Christianity. Beginning around the 14th century, Islamic influence spread through Mindanao, carried by Muslim traders and missionaries. While coastal populations embraced Islam more fully, the Subanen, living primarily in upland regions, experienced only partial influence. Those who converted became known as Kalabugan or Kalibigan, integrating Islamic practices into their lives while retaining linguistic and cultural ties with other Subanen. Their language adopted Arabic terms for rituals and prayers, yet their identity remained tied to Subanen roots. Spanish colonization in the 16th century introduced Christianity, particularly Catholicism. Missionaries sought to convert upland populations, but the remoteness of Subanen communities made widespread Christianization difficult. Still, over centuries, many Subanen gradually adopted Christian practices, especially in areas near towns like Buklog and Dapin. Churches were established, schools opened, and baptism became common. Yet even for Christianized Subanen, traces of animism persisted. Ancestor veneration, agricultural rituals, and respect for nature spirits remained part of daily life, blending with Christian festivals and prayers. This religious blending illustrates the adaptability of the Subanen people. Rather than abandoning their ancestral worldview entirely, they incorporated new elements into existing traditions. For example, Catholic saints might be honored alongside ancestral spirits, or Islamic prayers might be recited before farming rituals. This syncretism preserved continuity while accommodating change. Religion thus became both a marker of diversity, distinguishing Animist, Muslim, and Christian Subanen, and a symbol of resilience, demonstrating the ability of the Subanen to absorb outside influences without losing their cultural essence. Through these encounters, the Subanen preserved a unique spiritual identity that continues to shape their worldview today. Agriculture has always been the backbone of Subanen livelihood. Rice is the most important crop, not only for sustenance, but also as a symbol of life and prosperity. The Subanen traditionally practiced shifting cultivation, also called kaiingen, which involved clearing forested land for planting and then moving to new areas once soil fertility declined. This method reflected both ecological adaptation and spiritual practice. Before clearing a new field, families performed rituals to ask permission from forest spirits and to ensure good harvests. The act of cutting trees, burning brush, and planting seeds was never treated as a mere economic task. It was a sacred cycle of renewal. Fields were planted not only with rice, but also with corn, cassava, yams, bananas, and vegetables. These diversified crops ensured survival in case rice failed. The Subanen understood the rhythms of the land, timing planting and harvesting to seasonal cycles and celestial signs. Hunting and gathering supplemented agriculture, with men hunting wild pigs, deer, and birds, while women collected fruits, roots, and medicinal plants. In this way, the Subanen economy was directly tied to the forest ecosystem, combining cultivation, foraging, and pastoralism. Livestock raising was also integral. Pigs and chickens were common, both for food and for ritual sacrifices. Cattle and water buffalo were highly valued, used for plowing fields and as symbols of wealth. Livestock ownership was also tied to social status, as those who could contribute animals to community feasts gained prestige. In the Subanen worldview, however, animals were not just property, they were part of the sacred economy. A sacrificed pig at a ritual feast was believed to mediate between humans and spirits, ensuring fertility and protection. Thus, agriculture and livestock raising were not purely economic, but deeply cultural, binding the Subanen to their land and to the unseen world. Although the Subanen lived mostly in upland areas, they were never isolated from coastal trade networks. From early times, Subanen groups exchanged forest products such as beeswax, resins, rattan, and camphor with Moro traders and Visayan merchants. In return, they received salt, cloth, iron tools, and sometimes firearms. This system of exchange connected the Subanen to the wider economic world of Mindanao and the Sulu Sea, linking them indirectly to global trade routes that reached as far as China and the Middle East. Trade was not only material, but also cultural. Through interaction with Muslim traders, Subanen communities adopted new words, rituals, and even religious practices. The Calibigan subgroup emerged in part through this constant contact. Similarly, exchanges with Visayans brought in household goods and loanwords, gradually creating linguistic blends in certain areas. Despite these influences, however, the Subanen maintained control over their upland resources. Their economic strength lay in the fact that they were custodians of forest wealth, which coastal traders depended upon. Barter remained the main form of exchange well into the colonial period. Subanen communities valued reciprocity over monetary gain. Trade relationships were often framed as alliances, reinforced by kinship ties or ritual friendships. This emphasis on trust and balance ensured long-term relationships with trading partners. It also protected the Subanen from exploitation, at least until colonial structures imposed cash economies and taxation. Even then, many Subanen resisted full monetization, preferring to rely on traditional barter systems within their communities. This resilience illustrates the adaptability of Subanen economic life. They could engage with external markets without abandoning their own values of reciprocity and communal sharing. The entry of the Spanish into Mindanao during the 16th century brought dramatic changes to the Zamboanga Peninsula and to the Subanen people. When Miguel Lopez de Legazpi and subsequent expeditions attempted to extend Spanish control southward, they encountered stiff resistance from Muslim sultanates already established in coastal areas. The Subanen, living primarily in upland regions, were not initially the main target of Spanish conquest. However, the presence of missionaries and soldiers gradually expanded inland, affecting even remote communities. Spanish priests wrote of the Subanos as a heathen people, Gentiles who needed conversion. They saw in the Subanen an opportunity to expand Christianity where resistance was less fierce than in Moro-dominated coasts. Yet the Subanen were not passive. Their decentralized society and mobile lifestyle made them difficult to control. Unlike centralized sultanates or large lowland villages, Subanen settlements were scattered across ridges and valleys. Spanish troops often found it difficult to locate them, let alone impose tribute or forced labor. This geographical advantage allowed many communities to maintain autonomy despite centuries of colonial presence. Still, the spread of reductions, the Spanish policy of resettling dispersed groups into compact villages near churches, gradually drew some Subanen into colonial structures. These settlements, often near towns like Dapitan, became sites of cultural transformation where Subanen converted to Catholicism, adopted Spanish surnames, and learned new agricultural techniques. Even so, most Subanen preferred to remain in upland areas, where they could preserve their rituals and traditions. They often maintained a dual relationship with colonial authorities, outward compliance when necessary, but continued practice of ancestral customs in hidden spaces. This pattern of selective adaptation and resistance characterized Subanen responses to Spanish colonization. They could not fully escape colonial presence, but neither did they surrender their identity. Instead, they crafted a delicate balance. Adopting elements of Christianity or Spanish culture were useful, while preserving core aspects of their worldview. Despite their relative isolation, the Subanen were not immune to the pressures of Spanish colonization. Tribute systems demanded labor, forest products, or crops from upland communities. Soldiers often enforced these demands with violence, causing Subanen families to retreat further into remote valleys. Christianized Subanen in lowland settlements faced stricter control, with priests monitoring rituals and punishing animist practices. Yet resistance persisted in subtle forms. Families continued to hold ceremonies in forest clearings or ancestral groves, away from the eyes of missionaries. Shamans preserved chants and healing rituals orally, ensuring that knowledge survived even under suppression. Conflict also arose indirectly. The Subanen were often caught between Spanish forces and Moro raiders, who resisted Spanish control. Coastal raids sometimes extended inland, targeting Subanen villages perceived as allies of the colonizers. This created cycles of displacement and insecurity, further pushing the Subanen into remote areas. Their reputation as a peaceful people was sometimes overshadowed by the narrative of being victims of both Spanish oppression and Moro aggression. Yet survival strategies evolved. Mobility, kinship alliances, and barter trade with multiple groups ensured resilience. Over time, Spanish influence deepened in certain areas. Mission stations like Dapitan became centers of Christianized Subanen communities. Jose Rizal himself lived in Dapitan during his exile, and record from that period mentioned Subanen participation in colonial structures. Still, the majority of Subanen remained uplanders, marginalized from both the colonial state and Moro polities. This marginalization paradoxically helped preserve their traditions, as remoteness shielded them from full assimilation. In this sense, resistance was less about open rebellion and more about persistence, holding on to ancestral lifeways despite external pressures. Missionary activity was the spearhead of Spanish efforts to transform Subanen society. Jesuits, Augustinians, and other orders worked tirelessly to convert upland peoples, framing their rituals as idolatry and their shamans as sorcerers. Christianization campaigns introduced baptism, confession, and mass, often accompanied by education in Spanish prayers and hymns. The Subanen who converted sometimes integrated Christian saints into their spiritual world, seeing them as powerful figures similar to ancestral spirits. In this way, syncretism emerged, blending Catholic and Subanen practices. However, conversion was never absolute. Many Subanen adopted Christianity outwardly while maintaining animist rituals privately. They attended church services yet continued to honor ancestors with offerings of rice, betel nut, and animal sacrifices. Missionaries frequently lamented this backsliding, but from the Subanen perspective, it was a strategy of cultural balance. They could engage with colonial power without abandoning their roots. In fact, some rituals were reinterpreted through Christian language. Agricultural feasts, for example, might include prayers to saints alongside traditional chants. Education introduced by missionaries also had mixed effects. On the one hand, literacy in Spanish opened opportunities for interaction with colonial authorities. On the other hand, schools sometimes undermined native language and traditions. Yet Subanen families selectively embraced what was useful: basic literacy, access to trade, or alliance with powerful patrons, while resisting cultural erasure. By the end of Spanish rule, the Subanen had experienced deep transformation but not assimilation. They had adapted, blended, and survived, ensuring that their identity endured into the next era of colonial disruption under the Americans. The dawn of the 20th century brought another wave of transformation for the Subanen, this time under American colonial rule. Unlike the Spanish, who focused heavily on Christianization and religious assimilation, the Americans introduced a more systematic administration designed to reorganize the entire Philippine archipelago under a modern colonial state. For the Subanen, this meant a shift from religious pressure to economic and political restructuring. American officials, soldiers, and anthropologists ventured deep into Mindanao, documenting, categorizing, and ultimately reshaping the lives of indigenous peoples. One of the earliest American ethnographers to study the Subanen was John P. Finley, who compiled detailed descriptions of their lifeways in the early 1900s. He built on earlier Spanish accounts, but framed the Subanen through the lens of American anthropology, labeling them as tribal peoples who needed modernization. His descriptions of their shifting cultivation, animist practices, and decentralized leadership influenced colonial policies. The Americans portrayed the Subanen as non-Moro and non-Christian, placing them within the broader category of non-Christian tribes, a classification that shaped legislation. Under the Moro province government, 1903 to 1913, the Subanen were administered separately from Christianized Filipinos. Policies aimed to civilize and integrate them into the colonial economy. Schools were established, teaching English as the medium of instruction. Roads and military posts were constructed across the Zamboanga Peninsula, opening upland areas to external markets. At first, these changes appeared to bring opportunities: literacy, trade access, and infrastructure. Yet beneath this modernization lay a deeper process of dispossession. Land tenure systems introduced by the Americans undermined traditional Subanen concepts of ancestral land, transforming communal domains into parcels that could be titled, bought, and sold. This marked the beginning of large-scale alienation of Subanen lands. Perhaps the most profound impact of American colonial rule on the Subanen was the transformation of land ownership. For centuries, the Subanen had regarded land as communal and ancestral. Families cultivated fields through shifting agriculture, moving when soil fertility declined, while maintaining a spiritual relationship with forests, rivers, and mountains. The introduction of the Public Land Act and the system of land titling in the early 20th century redefined this relationship. Land that was not formally titled was declared public domain, open to settlement by Christian migrants from the Visayas and Luzon. Subanen communities lacking knowledge of legal systems and literacy in English, were unable to secure titles to their ancestral lands. This dispossession coincided with the rise of commercial logging. The Americans and later Filipino elites granted logging concessions across the Zamboanga Peninsula. Ancient forests that had sustained Subanen rituals, agriculture, and hunting were cut down for export. Logging roads opened new areas to settlers, accelerating migration into what were once Subanen homelands. The Subanen found themselves pushed further into marginal upland areas, often labeled as squatters on lands they had occupied for generations. Economic displacement followed. Families who once depended on diverse forest resources now had fewer options, leading some to work as laborers for logging companies or plantations. Despite these challenges, the Subanen continued to adapt. Some communities began cultivating cash crops, such as corn and abaca, integrating themselves into the colonial economy. Others retreated deeper into remote areas, maintaining shifting agriculture and ritual life away from the gaze of authorities. Resistance also surfaced, not always in open rebellion, but in persistence, holding on to ancestral rituals, practicing subsistence farming, and teaching oral traditions despite colonial encroachment. In this way, the Subanen demonstrated resilience, even as their economic foundation was eroded by land, alienation, and environmental destruction. American colonial policy emphasized education as a tool of assimilation. Schools were established in larger Subanen settlements, teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, and American ideals of democracy. English became the language of instruction, replacing local dialects in formal settings. While literacy opened opportunities for some Subanen, it also introduced cultural shifts that weakened oral traditions. Children trained in schools often learned to look down on their own rituals, labeling them as superstitions. This generational divide created tensions within communities, as younger Subanen were pulled into colonial frameworks while elders preserved ancestral practices. Governance also changed under American rule. The role of traditional leaders like the Timuay was undermined as colonial officials imposed new systems of municipal government. Subanen leaders were sometimes appointed as intermediaries, but were often stripped of their authority in favor of mayors and officials loyal to the colonial state. Customary law, once the foundation of conflict resolution, was replaced by courts applying American and Philippine statutes. This shift eroded local autonomy, centralizing power in colonial institutions. Yet cultural resilience remained visible. Even as schools and governance structures spread, many Subanen continued to honor their rituals in secret. Agricultural ceremonies, healing practices, and the great Buklog festival survived, often blending with new influences. For example, Christian hymns might be sung at a feast alongside traditional chants, or American tools might be used in farming rituals that still invoke spirits. This syncretism reflected the Subanen strategy of adaptation. They could absorb new elements without losing their essence. By the time the Americans departed, the Subanen had endured profound economic, political, and cultural disruptions. Yet their identity, rooted in land, kinship, and spirituality, remained intact, preparing them for the next challenges of independence and nation building. When the Philippines gained independence from the United States in 1946, the Subanen entered yet another phase of historical transformation. The new Philippine Republic was focused on nation building, forging unity among diverse ethnic groups and accelerating modernization. However, Indigenous peoples like the Subanen often found themselves marginalized within this project. The state prioritized lowland Christian Filipinos, while upland communities were viewed as backward or unassimilated. Despite being one of the most ancient inhabitants of Mindanao, the Subanen were rarely consulted in the shaping of policies that directly affected their lives. The government encouraged migration from Luzon and the Visayas into Mindanao under resettlement programs, particularly through agencies like the National Land Settlement Administration, NLSA. While intended to reduce land pressure in the North and Central Philippines, these programs resulted in massive waves of Christian settlers occupying lands that had long been part of Subanen ancestral domains. Forests and valleys were transformed into agricultural settlements, often with legal land titles that excluded Subanen families. This migration significantly altered the demographic balance of the Zamboanga Peninsula, creating tensions between indigenous people and newcomers. The Subanen responded in various ways. Some communities integrated into local economies, hiring themselves out as laborers or engaging in trade with settlers. Others retreated deeper into upland areas, preserving shifting cultivation practices and ancestral rituals. Yet the underlying reality was one of increasing marginalization. The Subanen, once the primary inhabitants of Zamboanga, became minorities in many areas, surrounded by settlers who controlled commerce, politics, and land ownership. Despite these challenges, the Subanen continued to identify themselves as gbansa Subanon, maintaining cultural pride and ancestral memory even as the modern nation-state often ignored their rights. The decades following independence witnessed an intensification of land struggles in the Subanen homeland. The Philippine state, eager to modernize, opened up vast areas for logging, mining, and agribusiness. Multinational corporations secured concessions to exploit Mindanao's forests and mineral wealth, particularly in Zamboanga del Norte and Zamboanga del Sur. These projects devastated ecosystems that the Subanen depended upon for farming, hunting, and ritual life. Logging companies cleared ancestral forests at unprecedented scales, while mining operations displaced entire communities. Without formal land titles, Subanen communities were powerless to resist. Government policies defined untitled lands as public domain, making them available for commercial use. This legal framework erased centuries of ancestral occupancy, reducing the Subanen to squatters on their own lands. Protests occasionally emerged, but they were often ignored or suppressed. Meanwhile, the presence of armed groups, both state forces and local militias, created insecurity in rural areas. Many Subanen families experienced displacement, forced to migrate further into mountains or join the swelling ranks of rural poor. Despite this marginalization, the Subanen did not disappear. They preserved their lifeways, cultivating corn, cassava, and rice in upland fields. Rituals like the Buklog continued, though sometimes with fewer resources. Oral tradition and kinship networks sustained identity, even when land was lost. The Subanen also began forging alliances with emerging indigenous rights movements, which sought recognition of ancestral domains. These alliances laid the groundwork for future struggles for legal recognition, particularly in the late 20th century with the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. The persistence of land struggles in the post-war era underscores both the vulnerability and resilience of the Subanen. Vulnerable to state neglect and corporate exploitation, yet resilient in maintaining cultural survival. The post-independence period in the Philippines was marked by political upheavals, including the rise of insurgencies, martial law under Ferdinand Marcos, and regional conflicts in Mindanao. These broader struggles often intersected with Subanen life in complex ways. In areas where the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, and later the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, MILF, operated, the Subanen were caught in the crossfire. Their territories, lying between Moro-controlled coastal zones and settler-dominated lowlands, became contested spaces. Armed encounters sometimes displaced Subanen villages, forcing families to flee temporarily and disrupting farming cycles. During the Marcos era, 1972 to 1986, martial law brought intensified militarization to Mindanao. Logging concessions expanded under crony capitalism, accelerating the destruction of ancestral forests. Military forces tasked with counterinsurgency frequently occupied upland areas, pressuring Subanen communities. Yet paradoxically, this period also fostered indigenous consciousness. The Subanen began articulating their identity more assertively, connecting their struggles with those of other Lumad groups across Mindanao. Cultural festivals, rituals, and oral histories became rallying points for asserting continuity. Elders emphasized to younger generations that despite upheavals, the Subanen remained rooted in their ancestral lands. Cultural continuity was also visible in the blending of traditions with new influences. Subanen Christians incorporated church festivals into agricultural rituals, while those influenced by Islam blended Arabic prayers with ancestral chants. This syncretism did not erase identity, but enriched it, showing the Subanen capacity to adapt while holding onto core values. Music, dance, and the Buklog festival continued to symbolize resilience, drawing together scattered communities. In this way, even amid political instability, the Subanen preserved their identity, sustaining a cultural flame that colonialism, land loss, and state neglect had failed to extinguish. The declaration of martial law by President Ferdinand Marcos in 1972 had a profound impact on the Subanen. Already marginalized by land loss and logging concessions, they now faced heightened militarization across Mindanao. The Zamboanga Peninsula, long a frontier between Moro-controlled coasts and settler-dominated lowlands, became a zone of intense military activity. Government troops poured into the region to suppress the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF rebellion, but in practice, their presence affected Lumad communities like the Subanen just as much. Subanen villages found themselves caught in the crossfire between rebels and state forces. Upland areas were patrolled by the military, and suspicions of collaboration with Moro rebels or communist insurgents often led to harassment. Families were forced to evacuate, abandoning farms and ancestral lands. Displacement disrupted agricultural cycles, leading to hunger and poverty. At the same time, logging concessions continued under the Marcos regime, granted to cronies who exploited vast tracts of Mindanao forests. These logging operations often relied on military protection, meaning that the same forces displacing Subanen villages also guarded corporations cutting down ancestral forests. Yet even under repression, the Subanen resisted. Their resistance was rarely open rebellion, but quiet persistence, rebuilding villages after evacuations, continuing rituals in secrecy, and passing down oral traditions under threat. For many, the Buklog festival became not just a ritual of thanksgiving, but an act of defiance, affirming continuity in the face of dispossession. Martial law was a time of suffering, but it also sharpened indigenous consciousness. The Subanen came to recognize that their struggles were not isolated, but part of broader patterns of exploitation in Mindanao. This realization laid the foundation for alliances with other Lumad groups and human rights advocates who would later push for indigenous recognition. During the 1970s and 1980s, indigenous movements began to emerge across Mindanao, driven by the shared experiences of displacement, militarization, and exploitation. The Subanen became part of this broader awakening of Lumad identity. The term Lumad itself, meaning native or indigenous, was adopted by various non-Muslim, non-Christian groups in Mindanao as a political category. For the Subanen, Identifying as Lumad provided a platform for unity and advocacy, connecting them with the Manobo, Higanon, Bland, and other indigenous peoples facing similar struggles. These movements emphasized ancestral domain as the core of indigenous rights. The Subanen, like other Lumad, demanded recognition of their lands, not as state-owned public domain, but as ancestral territories passed down through generations. Advocacy groups, NGOs, and church-based organizations supported these demands, documenting land dispossession and human rights abuses. The voices of Subanen leaders, often marginalized in local politics, gained visibility through these alliances. They participated in conferences, rallies, and dialogues, articulating grievances and envisioning futures where indigenous peoples could live with dignity on their lands. Cultural revival accompanied political activism. Festivals, rituals, and traditional chants were highlighted in public gatherings as symbols of resilience. The Buklog Festival, in particular, became both cultural performance and political statement, showcasing the vitality of Subanen identity. Songs, dances, and epics were revived to strengthen community pride. In the process, younger generations, some educated in missionary or public schools, reconnected with traditions that had been suppressed or forgotten. By the late 1980s, the Subanen were no longer silent victims of history, but active participants in indigenous assertion, demanding recognition within the Philippine nation. The fall of Marcos in 1986 and the restoration of democracy under President Corazon Aquino opened new spaces for indigenous advocacy. The Subanen, along with other Lumad groups, participated in dialogues with the new government, pushing for recognition of ancestral land rights. Constitutional reform in 1987 included provisions for the protection of indigenous peoples and their communities, marking a turning point in policy. While implementation remained slow and contested, these provisions created a legal basis for future legislation. In the Zamboanga Peninsula, Subanen leaders began organizing more systematically. They established councils, held meetings, and documented ancestral claims. Support from NGOs and church networks strengthened their capacity to engage with legal processes. International advocacy also played a role, as global movements for indigenous rights highlighted the struggles of Philippine Lumad communities. By the 1990s, momentum was building toward comprehensive legislation. This momentum culminated in the passage of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, in 1997. Although its full implementation would remain fraught with challenges, the IPRA recognized ancestral domains, self-governance, and cultural integrity. For the Subanen, this was a historic milestone. It marked the first time the Philippine state formally acknowledged their rights to land and identity. The seeds of this recognition, however, had been sown decades earlier during martial law, when suffering, displacement, and resistance forged a stronger indigenous consciousness. Through struggle, the Subanen transformed from marginalized uplanders into recognized stakeholders in the Philippine nation, asserting their rightful place in history. The passage of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, in 1997 was one of the most significant developments in modern Philippine history for indigenous peoples, including the Subanen. For the first time, national legislation explicitly recognized the rights of indigenous cultural communities to their ancestral domains, self-governance, and cultural integrity. This law marked the culmination of decades of struggle, advocacy, and resistance by Lumad groups, Subanen among them, who had endured centuries of land dispossession and cultural marginalization. Under IPRA, the concept of ancestral domain became legally binding. It recognized that indigenous peoples were not squatters on public lands, as the state had often declared, but rightful custodians of territories they had occupied for generations. For the Subanen, this recognition validated their long-standing connection to the Zamboanga Peninsula, a land they considered their gbansa, or nation. It gave legal grounding to their oral histories, genealogies, and rituals that had always affirmed their ownership of forests, rivers, and valleys. The law also created the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, NCIP, tasked with implementing IPRA and facilitating the titling of ancestral domains through certificates of ancestral domain titles, CADs. For Subanen communities, this provided an avenue to secure legal recognition of lands they had long cultivated and protected. However, the process was complex, requiring documentation, maps, testimonies, and compliance with bureaucratic procedures unfamiliar to many upland communities. Despite these challenges, the Subanen saw in IPRA a new horizon, a chance to reclaim dignity and secure land for future generations. While IPRA promised recognition, the actual process of securing ancestral domain titles was far from straightforward. Subanen communities had to navigate a bureaucratic maze, often lacking resources, technical knowledge, or political influence. Many areas of their ancestral land overlapped with concessions already granted to logging, mining, or agribusiness companies. In such cases, corporate interests clashed with indigenous claims, leading to prolonged disputes. Local governments, too, were sometimes reluctant to support Subanen petitions, fearing loss of revenue or political control. Despite these obstacles, several Subanen groups pursued ancestral domain claims with determination. They documented oral histories, ancestral markers, and rituals as evidence of long-term occupation. Elders testified before government agencies, recounting generations of settlement along rivers, mountains, and fields. NGOs, church-based organizations, and advocacy groups provided legal and technical support, helping to prepare maps and legal documents. Gradually, some communities succeeded in securing CADs, gaining formal recognition of their ancestral territories. These titles did not end all disputes. Corporate and state interests often continued to encroach, but they strengthened Subanen leverage in negotiations. The struggle over implementation revealed a deeper truth. Recognition on paper was not enough. Land rights required continuous defense, both legally and on the ground. Subanen communities learned to organize, form councils, and assert collective decisions regarding resource use. Ritual leaders, Timuay, and elders played crucial roles in guiding claims, ensuring that legal processes aligned with cultural traditions. The pursuit of ancestral domain thus became not only a legal battle, but also a cultural revival, reaffirming the Subanen's bond with their homeland in the face of modern challenges. One of the most powerful outcomes of IPRA was the revitalization of Subanen identity. The law's recognition of cultural integrity encouraged communities to openly celebrate traditions once marginalized or suppressed. Festivals, dances, and rituals were performed with renewed pride, often presented both within communities and in public events showcasing Lumad heritage. The Buklog festival, already central to Subanen ritual life, gained even greater symbolic significance. It was not only an act of thanksgiving, but also a demonstration of cultural survival in a legal and political context that now acknowledged its importance. Self-determination also became a guiding principle. With ancestral domain titles, communities gained the right to manage resources according to their own traditions. This included decisions about farming, forest protection, and the regulation of outside enterprises. While challenges remained, especially from mining and logging companies, the principle of self-governance empowered the Subanen to assert control over their future. Councils of elders and Timuay leaders re-emerged as central authorities, blending traditional governance with new legal frameworks. Cultural revitalization extended to language and oral tradition. Schools began integrating Subanen language and history into curricula, while NGOs supported projects to document epics, chants, and genealogies. Younger generations, once alienated by formal education systems, rediscovered pride in their heritage. This revival was not merely symbolic. It was a form of resistance against centuries of erasure. The Subanen asserted that their survival was not just about land, but about identity, about being gbansa Subanon in a modern nation state. Through IPRA, the seeds of self-determination were planted, though their growth required continuous vigilance, unity, and cultural strength. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought a new wave of challenges to Subanen ancestral domains, particularly through the rise of large-scale mining operations. The Zamboanga Peninsula, rich in minerals such as gold, copper, nickel, and chromite, attracted corporations seeking to exploit its resources. Government policies promoting foreign investment further fueled the mining boom. For the Subanen, whose ancestral territories overlapped with mineral-rich areas, this development threatened not only their land, but their very way of life. Mining concessions were often granted by the national government without proper consultation of local communities. Despite the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, mandating free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, companies frequently bypassed or manipulated this requirement. Subanen villages found themselves suddenly confronted with prospectors, surveyors, and heavy machinery entering their lands. Forests that had provided food, medicine, and ritual sites for generations were cleared to make way for exploration roads. Rivers, vital for farming and daily life, were contaminated by runoff from mining activities. For the Subanen, the issue was not merely economic, but spiritual. Ancestral lands were sacred, containing sites where rituals connected humans with spirits and ancestors. Mining that dug into mountains or polluted rivers was seen as an act of desecration, disrupting cosmic balance. Elders warned that such violations would bring misfortune, not only for the Subanen, but for all who lived in the region. Thus, opposition to mining was both a defense of livelihood and a spiritual obligation. Communities began organizing protests, filing petitions, and linking with environmental groups. The emergence of mining as a central issue thrust the Subanen into the national spotlight, highlighting their struggle as both an indigenous and environmental cause. As mining operations expanded, Subanen communities mobilized to resist encroachment. Traditional leaders, particularly the Timuay, played a central role in uniting communities and articulating opposition. The authority of the Timuay was rooted in custom law, gukom, and spiritual responsibility, making them key voices in both local rituals and political negotiations. Councils of elders convened to discuss strategies, balancing traditional decision-making with the demands of modern advocacy. Their message was clear. Mining without genuine consent was a violation of Subanen rights and an assault on their cultural integrity. Protests took many forms. Some communities organized road blockades to stop company trucks from entering ancestral lands. Others filed legal cases with the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, NCP, demanding recognition of their right to free, prior, and informed consent. Alliances with NGOs, church groups, and human rights organizations amplified their voices, bringing national and international attention to their struggles. Media coverage of environmental destruction and human rights abuses in Subanen areas exposed the darker side of mining operations, pressuring companies and government agencies to respond. However, resistance was not without risks. Leaders who spoke out against mining faced harassment, threats, and sometimes violence. Division also emerged within communities, as some individuals were persuaded by promises of jobs, infrastructure, or compensation. Mining companies often exploited these divisions, presenting agreements signed by a few individuals as proof of consent. Despite these challenges, the Subanen movement persisted, rooted in collective memory and spiritual duty. For many, the struggle against mining was not only about defending land, but about fulfilling ancestral responsibility to protect the earth for future generations. The environmental impact of mining in Subanen areas was severe and long-lasting. Deforestation destroyed habitats for wildlife and reduced access to forest products essential for daily life. Rivers, once sources of drinking water and irrigation, became polluted with silt and chemicals, causing declines in fish populations and affecting rice fields downstream. Soil erosion increased, leading to landslides that endangered villages. For people whose identity was deeply tied to the land, these ecological disruptions were not just environmental crises, but cultural traumas. Yet amid these challenges, the Subanen demonstrated remarkable resilience. Ritual life continued, with ceremonies held to heal the land and restore balance. Elders emphasized that cultural survival required defending both the physical environment and the spiritual connections embedded within it. The Buklog festival, with its symbolic stamping to awaken spirits, was performed not only as thanksgiving, but as a plea for protection against environmental destruction. In this way, ritual and resistance converged, giving spiritual depth to environmental advocacy. Younger generations also became more involved in activism, blending traditional identity with modern tools of advocacy. Subanen youth used education, media, and social networks to amplify their voices. Some became lawyers, teachers, or community organizers, bridging ancestral traditions with contemporary struggles. Environmental defense thus became a site of cultural renewal, reminding the Subanen that their identity was inseparable from the land. The fight against mining highlighted a truth that had always been central to their worldview. To be Subanen is to be rooted in the earth, and defending the environment is defending life itself. Education has long been a double-edged sword for the Subanen people. From the American colonial period, when English language schools were first introduced, to the Philippine Republic's expansion of public education, schools became both gateways to opportunity and instruments of assimilation. For many Subanen families, sending children to school promised literacy, employment, and participation in the modern economy. Yet at the same time, education often distanced the youth from their ancestral traditions. Textbooks written from a lowland Filipino perspective presented history that excluded or marginalized indigenous peoples, while rituals and oral traditions were dismissed as superstitions. Generational tensions emerged as a result. Elders who carried oral traditions and ritual knowledge sometimes felt that their authority was undermined by younger Subanen trained in formal schools. The prestige of literacy and diplomas overshadowed the value of oral wisdom, creating fractures in the community. Many young Subanen, eager to succeed in mainstream society, began to adopt Visayan or Tagalog as daily languages, leaving Subanen speech confined to private settings. The erosion of language was seen by elders as a threat to identity, since words carried not only meaning but cultural memory. Yet education was not only destructive, it also became a tool for empowerment. Some Subanen youth used their schooling to defend ancestral rights, becoming teachers, lawyers, or advocates for indigenous peoples. They wrote down oral traditions, documented genealogies, and helped communities file legal claims for ancestral domains. Schools supported by NGOs or church groups began integrating indigenous culture into curricula, teaching Subanen history, language, and rituals alongside mainstream subjects. In this way, education became a site of tension, but also possibility, a battleground where assimilation and empowerment played out simultaneously. Modernization reached the Subanen in uneven ways. In towns like Buklog, Dapitan, and Pagadian, Subanen families increasingly engaged with market economies, selling crops, handicrafts, or labor. Roads and infrastructure connected upland areas to lowland markets, making it easier to transport corn, cassava, or abaca for sale. At the same time, modernization also meant deeper integration into a cash economy, which often disadvantaged the Subanen. Without capital or access to credit, many became dependent on traders and middlemen, selling products at low prices while buying goods at high cost. The arrival of new technologies further altered daily life. Radios, cell phones, and eventually the internet brought new forms of communication and entertainment. These tools connected Subanen youth to global culture, from pop music to social media, while sometimes pulling them further away from oral tradition. Agricultural technologies also shifted practices, with chemical fertilizers and modern tools replacing older methods in some areas. While these changes increased productivity, they also introduced dependency on external suppliers, undermining self-sufficiency. Cultural adaptation accompanied these economic changes. Subanen dances and music were sometimes performed on stage for tourism festivals, reframed as cultural showcases for outsiders. While this visibility gave pride, it also risked turning sacred traditions into entertainment. Some rituals, once performed for spiritual purposes, were shortened or modified for public presentation. This commercialization sparked debates within communities about authenticity, dignity, and cultural survival. For some, modernization represented opportunity. For others, it threatened the erosion of identity. The Subanen walked a careful path, adapting to economic shifts while trying to preserve cultural roots. One of the central struggles of modernization has been the preservation of Subanen identity. As Visayan, Tagalog, and English became dominant languages in towns and schools, Subanen language faced decline. Elders warned that the loss of language would mean the loss of cultural essence. In response, community leaders and NGOs began initiatives to document and teach Subanen speech. Dictionaries, primers, and recorded oral traditions were created to ensure that younger generations could learn. Language preservation became a form of cultural renewal, reconnecting youth to ancestral identity. Cultural renewal also extended to festivals and rituals. The Buklog was revived not only as a ritual, but as a declaration of identity in the face of modernization. Subanen music, with its gongs and flutes, was taught to young performers, blending traditional instruments with modern influences. Weaving and crafts, once dismissed as old-fashioned, were promoted as symbols of heritage and sources of livelihood through cultural tourism. These initiatives sought to ensure that modernization did not erase tradition, but allowed it to evolve in meaningful ways. At the same time, Subanen identity became more political. Youth and leaders alike asserted that being Subanen was not simply about wearing traditional clothes or performing dances for tourists, but about maintaining connection to land, rituals, and community values. Identity was redefined as both cultural pride and political struggle, linking ancestral heritage with the fight for land rights and environmental defense. In this way, modernization did not destroy Subanen culture, but transformed it into a more conscious and deliberate identity. The challenge was immense, but the Subanen showed once again their capacity to adapt, survive, and renew themselves in changing times. For centuries, the Subanen people maintained a sophisticated system of customary law known as gukom. Unlike codified legal systems introduced by colonizers, gukom was not written down but preserved through oral tradition, embodied in chants, stories, and the memory of elders. Its principles emphasized balance, reconciliation, and respect for both human and spiritual relationships. The purpose of justice in Subanen society was not punishment for its own sake, but the restoration of harmony between individuals, families, and the wider community. Disputes were common in any community, whether over land boundaries, marriage arrangements, theft, or accusations of sorcery. Instead of courts and police, the Subanen relied on councils of elders led by a Timuay, traditional leader. Hearings were held in communal spaces, often with both parties and their kin present. Elders listened to testimonies, invoked ancestral precedents, and sought solutions acceptable to both sides. Compensation was usually preferred over punishment. If someone stole livestock, they might be required to return the animal plus additional goods as a sign of apology. If conflict involved serious offenses like violence, reconciliation rituals were performed to cleanse anger and restore trust. What distinguished gukom was its spiritual dimension. Wrongdoing was not only an offense against another person, but also a disruption of cosmic balance. Spirits and ancestors were believed to watch human behavior, and unresolved disputes could invite illness, crop failure, or misfortune. Thus, rituals accompanied settlements, with offerings made to appease unseen forces. Justice was therefore inseparable from spirituality. Through gukom, the Subanen created a system of law deeply embedded in their worldview, one that prioritized peace and balance over retribution. Central to the Subanen legal and political system was the figure of the Timuay. Unlike kings or sultans, the Timuay was not a hereditary monarch, but a leader chosen for wisdom, fairness, and knowledge of custom law. The authority of a Timuay derived less from coercive power and more from moral standing. People followed a leader because they trusted his or her judgment, not because they feared punishment. This trust was earned through years of demonstrating fairness in disputes, mastery of oral traditions, and skill in mediating between human communities and the spirit world. The responsibilities of a Timuay were immense. They presided over councils, led rituals, and represented the community in dealings with outsiders. They were expected to know the genealogies of families, the histories of land boundaries, and the proper offerings for different spirits. In times of conflict with neighboring groups, they negotiated peace or organized defense. In dealings with colonizers, whether Spanish friars, American officials, or Filipino politicians, they served as mediators, seeking to protect community interests while avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. One of the most important roles of the Timuay was spiritual guardianship. The Subanen believed that leaders were responsible for maintaining harmony between humans and the unseen world. Failure to perform rituals correctly or allowing injustice to fester could anger spirits and bring calamity. Thus, the Timuay was not only a political leader, but also a custodian of cosmic balance. Their authority was reinforced by rituals of installation, in which the community affirmed trust in their leadership and invoked ancestral blessing. Through the Timuay, governance was both practical and sacred, ensuring that law, spirituality, and leadership were inseparably linked. Despite centuries of colonization and modern state governance, Subanen systems of law and leadership have endured. While municipal governments, courts, and police forces now dominate the Philippine legal system, many Subanen communities continue to resolve disputes through customary practices. Even when individuals seek formal courts, They often first consult elders or Timuay leaders, believing that local resolution is more effective and spiritually binding. This persistence highlights the resilience of indigenous governance in the face of external pressures. At the same time, Subanen governance has adapted to new realities. Some Timuay leaders have become recognized under Philippine law as indigenous political structures, a category acknowledged by the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA. This allows traditional leaders to participate in formal governance while maintaining their cultural role. Councils of elders are sometimes incorporated into barangay, village structures, creating hybrid forms of governance that blend state and indigenous systems. Subanen leaders also engage in advocacy, representing their people in regional and national forums on indigenous rights. The continuity of gukom and the authority of the Timuay underscore a broader truth. The Subanen view governance not simply as political administration, but as a moral and spiritual responsibility. Leadership is not about domination, but about service, fairness, and balance. This philosophy offers valuable insights, even in a modern world, where state systems often struggle to achieve justice that feels legitimate to local communities. For the Subanen, the endurance of their governance system is proof of cultural strength, showing that despite colonization, displacement, and modernization, their core values remain intact. For the Subanen people, rituals are not simply cultural performances, but sacred obligations that bind the community to the cosmos. Their animist worldview regards every element of nature, mountains, rivers, forests, and even large trees, as inhabited by spirits Dewata. These spirits are not distant gods, but immediate presences who influence daily life, agriculture, health, and social harmony. To neglect ritual obligations is to risk misfortune, illness, or disaster, while performing them properly ensures fertility, balance, and blessing. Thus, ritual life is at the very heart of Subanen identity. Rituals permeate every stage of life. Birth is accompanied by prayers for the child's health and offerings to ancestral spirits. Marriage involves blessings to ensure fertility and harmony between families. Death requires complex ceremonies guiding the departed into the ancestral realm. Agriculture, the backbone of livelihood, is surrounded by rituals from clearing a new field to planting and harvesting rice. Each ritual follows specific formulas of chants, offerings, and symbolic acts, all of which have been preserved through oral tradition for generations. Ritual specialists, often called Balian or shamans, act as mediators between humans and spirits. Their authority comes from knowledge of sacred chants, mastery of offerings, and ability to enter trance states. Some are believed to be chosen by spirits through dreams or illness, marked as individuals who must serve as bridges between realms. The Subanen respect these specialists not only for their spiritual power, but also for their role in preserving oral knowledge. Without them, rituals would lose their potency and the bond with spirits would weaken. In this way, ritual life is both spiritual practice and cultural archive, ensuring that Subanen cosmology remains alive across generations. Among all rituals, the Buklog stands as the most important and sacred. Often described as the pinnacle of Subanen ritual life, the Buklog is a grand Thanksgiving festival and a cosmic renewal ceremony. It requires enormous resources, communal effort, and careful ritual preparation. At its center is a massive wooden platform constructed above the ground, supported by a central post driven deep into the earth. Community members gather on this platform and stamp their feet in unison, producing vibrations that resonate through the post into the ground. This act symbolizes communication with ancestral spirits and deities, as if the stamping awakens them to witness the ritual. The Buklog serves multiple purposes. It is performed to give thanks for blessings, to mark recovery from calamities, or to fulfill vows made to spirits. It also reinforces communal solidarity, since hosting a Buklog requires cooperation and contributions from many families. Livestock such as pigs, chickens, and sometimes carabaos are sacrificed, while feasts of rice and root crops feed participants. Gongs and flutes provide continuous music, blending with ritual chants performed by shamans. The atmosphere is both sacred and celebratory, an affirmation of life, identity, and cosmic balance. Symbolically, the Buklog embodies Subanen philosophy of interconnectedness. The stamping platform represents the link between human community and the earth, between the visible and invisible worlds. The resonance is not only physical, but spiritual, sending messages of gratitude and requests for protection. UNESCO has recognized the Buklog as part of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity, highlighting its global significance. Yet for the Subanen, it remains first and foremost a sacred obligation, not a performance for outsiders. Is their way of ensuring that ancestral spirits remain aligned with the living, guiding the community toward prosperity and peace. In the modern era, the Buklog and other Subanen rituals face challenges of survival. The high cost of hosting a Buklog, requiring livestock, food, and weeks of preparation, makes it increasingly rare. Migration, poverty, and land loss reduce communities' ability to sustain such large-scale ceremonies. Some Buklog rituals have been shortened or adapted, performed for cultural festivals or tourism events. While these public displays bring visibility and pride, elders sometimes worry that sacred meaning is diluted when rituals are turned into spectacles. The tension between preservation and adaptation remains a central challenge. Despite these pressures, many Subanen remain committed to ritual life. Elders emphasize the necessity of passing on chants, songs, and ritual formulas to younger generations. Efforts are underway to document rituals in writing and recordings, ensuring that knowledge survives even if circumstances prevent full ceremonies. NGOs and cultural organizations support these initiatives, recognizing that rituals are not only spiritual acts, but repositories of history and identity. The inclusion of Buklog in global heritage lists has also provided opportunities for cultural advocacy, though communities insist that external recognition must respect local control. The survival of Subanen ritual life demonstrates remarkable resilience. Even in the face of colonization, modernization, and environmental destruction, rituals have endured as anchors of identity. They embody the Subanen understanding that to be human is to live in balance with spirits, ancestors, and nature. Festivals like the Buklog are not relics of the past, but living traditions, continuously renewed to meet contemporary realities. In defending and preserving their rituals, the Subanen defend not only their culture, but their very existence as a people. Music has always been central to Subanen cultural life, functioning not only as entertainment, but also as ritual communication with the spirit world. The Subanen musical tradition is dominated by gong ensembles, bamboo flutes, and vocal chants. Instruments like the kulintangan, a set of small gongs arranged horizontally, the agung, large suspended gongs, and the gong or babander provide melodic and rhythmic structures during rituals and social gatherings. These instruments are not mere objects of sound. They are sacred tools, believed to resonate with spiritual forces. When played in ritual contexts, their vibrations carry prayers and messages to the unseen world, reinforcing harmony between humans and spirits. The Kalintangan ensemble often accompanies major ceremonies such as weddings, healing rites, and the Buklog. Each piece of music has specific meanings, signaling joy, mourning, thanksgiving, or supplication. The rhythm of the agung sets the pace for communal dancing, while the higher tones of the smaller gongs weave melodic patterns. Bamboo flutes and zither add softer textures, often used in courtship or storytelling. These instruments, crafted from locally available materials like bamboo and bronze, demonstrate the Subanen's intimate relationship with their environment. The land itself provides the resources that give voice to cultural expression. Vocal music is equally important. Epic chants narrate the deeds of legendary ancestors, linking the present community with its mythic past. Healing chants call on spirits to release illness, while agricultural chants invoke blessings for rice and crops. These chants are often performed by ritual specialists who have memorized thousands of lines through years of apprenticeship. The act of chanting is considered powerful in itself. The words are believed to shape reality, binding the human and spiritual worlds. In this way, music among the Subanen is not a passive art, but an active force, sustaining cultural memory and spiritual vitality. Dance is another vital dimension of Subanen cultural expression. Unlike stage performances for tourists or festivals, traditional Subanen dances are deeply tied to rituals and community gatherings. Movements often imitate natural elements, swaying rice stalks, flowing rivers, the flight of birds, or the stealth of hunters. These gestures embody the Subanen worldview that humans are part of nature's rhythm, not separate from it. Each dance communicates meaning, whether invoking fertility, celebrating marriage, or honoring ancestral spirits. During the Buklog, dance takes on its most powerful form. As participants stomp on the ritual platform, the movement itself becomes an offering to the spirits. Circular dances performed around the platform symbolize unity and continuity, while paired dances often represent harmony between genders and families. Costumes of woven textiles, beaded necklaces, and brass ornaments enhance the visual symbolism. The brightness of colors, reds, yellows, and greens, conveys vitality, prosperity, and spiritual energy. Beyond ritual, dance also plays a role in courtship and social bonding. Young men and women sometimes engage in playful dances accompanied by flutes or gongs, allowing them to express affection within the boundaries of tradition. Elders encourage such performances, seeing them as both entertainment and cultural education. In modern times, some dances have been adapted for cultural festivals or competitions, bringing visibility to Subanen heritage. Yet within the community, the essence of dance remains spiritual and social rather than commercial. It is through dance that the Subanen embody their identity, inscribing their values into movement and gesture. Subanen material culture reflects both practicality and artistry. Everyday objects like mats, baskets, and clothing are crafted with skill, often decorated with symbolic designs that encode cultural meaning. Weaving is especially important, carried out primarily by women who learn techniques passed down through generations. Mats woven from pandan or rattan serve domestic needs, but also carry aesthetic value, with geometric patterns representing rivers, mountains, or stars. These patterns are not random. They embody stories, prayers, and ancestral wisdom. Clothing traditionally included woven skirts for women and trousers with embroidered designs for men. Beadwork adorned garments, symbolizing beauty, fertility, and social status. Brass ornaments, such as anklets, necklaces, and earrings, added further significance. These items were often exchanged during rituals, marriage ceremonies, or feasts, circulating as symbols of alliance and wealth. Even tools for farming or hunting were decorated, reminding users that utility and spirituality were inseparable. Brass casting and metalwork also formed part of Subanen craftsmanship. Gongs, bells, and ornaments were produced not only as trade items, but as sacred objects. The process of creating them involved rituals, as artisans sought permission from spirits before smelting metal. Thus, material culture was not merely functional, but embedded in cosmology. Every object carried spiritual resonance, linking its user to the broader world of nature and ancestors. In modern times, Subanen crafts face challenges from mass production and changing tastes. Yet communities continue to value weaving and beadwork as cultural markers. NGOs and cultural advocates promote handicrafts as sustainable livelihoods, linking them to cultural preservation. For the Subanen, creating and using these objects remains a way of asserting identity. Material culture is both memory and practice, anchoring them to ancestral tradition while adapting to new realities. In Subanen society, gender roles are defined by a balance of responsibility rather than rigid hierarchy. Men and women traditionally share tasks in ways that complement one another, ensuring the survival and harmony of the household and community. Men are often tasked with clearing forests, building houses, hunting, and protecting the community. These activities require physical strength and mobility, which men are expected to provide. Women, on the other hand, are central to cultivation, food preparation, weaving, child rearing, and ritual preparation. Their role is not confined to the domestic sphere, but extends to vital agricultural and spiritual duties. In rice cultivation, for example, men clear and prepare the fields, but women are primarily responsible for planting, weeding, and harvesting. This division reflects a balance. Men open the land, and women nurture it to fertility. Rituals also highlight gender complementarity. Women often play crucial roles in chants, dances, and offerings, ensuring that ceremonies are properly performed. While shamans, Balian, can be male or female, many are women, especially in healing rituals. This demonstrates that spiritual authority is not restricted by gender, but shared according to individual calling and ability. Marriage further demonstrates complementary roles. A wife is expected to manage household stability and agricultural tasks, while the husband secures external relations and contributes to communal obligations. Yet both are involved in decision-making, especially concerning land use, rituals, or the welfare of children. In disputes, women often serve as mediators, using their role as nurturers to restore peace. Far from being marginalized, Subanen women are respected for their indispensable contributions to family and community life. The balance of gender roles illustrates the Subanen worldview that harmony between men and women, humans and spirits, society and nature, is the foundation of existence. The Subanen family is not restricted to the nuclear household, but extends to kin networks that provide security, education, and identity. Children are raised not only by parents, but also by grandparents, uncles, aunts, and older siblings. This collective responsibility ensures that knowledge and values are transmitted across generations. Socialization begins early, with children learning through observation, participation, and storytelling. Elders narrate myths, chants, and genealogies, embedding cultural memory in daily life. Discipline is gentle but firm, focusing on guidance rather than punishment. Shame, yulaw, is often used as a corrective tool, as children are taught to respect elders and maintain family honor. The concept of muradabat, dignity, and pride guides behavior, instilling a sense of responsibility toward kin. Play also serves as education. Children mimic adult roles in games, practicing farming, dancing, or ritual acts. Songs and rhymes reinforce language and values, while participation in agricultural tasks trains them for adult responsibilities. Education in modern schools adds complexity to socialization. While literacy and formal knowledge provide opportunities, they sometimes create gaps between generations. Elders worry that children schooled in Tagalog, Visayan, or English lose touch with Subanen language and traditions. Yet many families strive for balance, ensuring that formal education is combined with cultural grounding. Some NGOs and church groups support programs where Subanen language and history are taught alongside mainstream subjects. Through this, socialization remains a dynamic process, blending tradition and modernity. Marriage in Subanen society is not only a personal union, but a communal alliance. Families play central roles in arranging and negotiating marriages, often involving discussions of bride price, resource sharing, and ceremonial exchanges. The bride price, paid in livestock, rice, brass ornaments, or woven goods, symbolizes the value of the woman's labor and fertility, as well as the alliance formed between families. It is not viewed as a purchase, but as a reciprocal exchange that strengthens kinship bonds. Wedding ceremonies involve elaborate rituals. Elders officiate, prayers are offered to ancestors, and feasts are held where gongs and dances proclaim communal joy. The marriage is sealed not only by human agreement, but by spiritual blessing. Divorce, while rare, is allowed under certain conditions, usually mediated by elders to ensure fairness and restitution. Widows and widowers often remarry, as family continuity is considered essential. Kinship extends beyond immediate family into a wide network of relatives bound by obligations of support. Families are expected to help one another during farming, construction, or rituals. Hospitality is a valued virtue. Guests are welcomed with food, betel nut, and warmth. Social obligations extend to the community as a whole, where cooperation is expressed in practices like pinakasi, mutual aid. This network of kinship and obligation ensures resilience, enabling the Subanen to withstand crises, adapt to change, and preserve cultural identity. In this framework, family life is not merely private, but a cornerstone of communal survival and spiritual balance. Within the Subanen worldview, the Balian, often translated as shaman, ritual specialist, or healer, holds a role of extraordinary importance. The Balian serves as the mediator between the visible world of humans and the unseen realm of spirits, ancestors, and deities. Their authority comes not from formal institutions, but from spiritual calling, often manifested through dreams, visions, or episodes of illness interpreted as signs of election by the spirits. Once chosen, a Balian undergoes long apprenticeships, learning ritual chants, medicinal knowledge, and ceremonial formulas from elder practitioners. The Balian's responsibilities extend across multiple domains. They conduct healing rituals for the sick, interpreting illness as the result of spiritual imbalance or the intrusion of malevolent forces. They preside over agricultural ceremonies, ensuring that rice planting and harvest proceed with divine blessing. They mediate disputes by invoking ancestral guidance, restoring harmony not only between individuals, but within the cosmic order. They also guide rites of passage, birth, marriage, and death, marking transitions with prayers and offerings that safeguard both individuals and families. Central to the Balian's power is mastery of oral tradition. Ritual chants can run for hours, invoking the names of deities, ancestors, and mythical events. These chants are not simply recitations, but performative acts that bring the unseen into presence. Every word carries power, shaping reality and commanding spiritual forces. For the Subanen, the Balian is thus indispensable. Without them, communication with the spiritual realm would falter, leaving the community vulnerable to misfortune. Their role embodies the Subanen understanding that health, prosperity, and harmony depend on maintaining balance between human life and the unseen cosmos. Healing is one of the most visible and vital functions of the Balian. Subanen conceptions of illness differ significantly from biomedical models. For them, sickness often results from spiritual causes: angered ancestors, offended forest spirits, or attacks by malevolent beings. Even physical injuries may be interpreted as having spiritual dimensions, requiring ritual treatment in addition to herbal remedies. The Balian diagnoses these conditions through divination, reading signs and dreams, interpreting animal behavior, or consulting ancestral spirits through trance states. Treatment typically involves both ritual and medicine. The Balian prepares herbal concoctions from local plants, applying them to wounds or administering them as teas. Subanen ethnobotany is extensive, with knowledge of hundreds of plants used for fever, infection, childbirth, or digestive issues. Yet these remedies are always accompanied by ritual acts, offerings of betel nut, rice, or animal sacrifice, chants invoking healing spirits, and symbolic gestures such as waving smoke or water over the patient to cleanse spiritual impurities. The Subanen believe that without ritual, even the most potent herb loses its effectiveness, as illness cannot be separated from spiritual imbalance. Healing rituals are also communal. Families gather to support the patient, sharing food, prayers, and music. Gongs may be played to call spirits, while chants narrate the journey of the patient's soul back to health. The community's presence reinforces solidarity, reminding all that illness is not an individual problem, but a collective concern. Through these practices, the Subanen integrate health, spirituality, and community into a single framework. Modern medicine may now coexist with these traditions, but for many Subanen, healing is not complete unless both the body and spirit are addressed. The Subanen cosmos is populated by a rich array of beings who influence human life. At the highest level is Magbabea, often described as the supreme deity or creator who governs the order of the universe. Beneath this deity are numerous Dewata, spirits associated with specific natural features: rivers, forests, mountains, and fields. These Dewata can bless or curse, depending on whether humans respect their domains. Ancestral spirits also play central roles, guiding and protecting descendants, but punishing neglect with illness or misfortune. Not all spirits are benevolent. Malevolent beings lurk in forests or abandoned places, preying on those who break taboos or fail to perform rituals. Shamans warn against traveling alone at night or neglecting offerings before cutting trees or crossing rivers. The Subanen cosmology is thus one of constant negotiation, where humans must live respectfully with a world alive with unseen powers. Rituals are the means of maintaining this balance, ensuring that humans remain in harmony with spiritual forces. These beliefs shape daily life in profound ways. Farming cannot begin without offerings to the spirit of the land. A birth is incomplete without prayers to ancestors. Death requires ceremonies guiding the soul safely into the afterlife. Even modern Subanen who practice Christianity or Islam often continue to respect these traditions, blending them with new faiths. This syncretism demonstrates the resilience of Subanen cosmology. Rather than disappearing under external religions, it adapts, incorporating new symbols while preserving the core principle of balance with the unseen. Through the world of spirits, the Subanen sustain a worldview where every act, Eating, planting, dancing, or healing is part of a larger cosmic dialogue. In contemporary times, the Subanen continue to face serious challenges rooted in historical marginalization. Despite being among the earliest inhabitants of the Zamboanga Peninsula, many Subanen communities remain economically disadvantaged, lacking access to basic services such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Roads to upland villages are often unpaved or impassable during rainy seasons, making trade, transport, and medical emergencies difficult. Schools are frequently underfunded, with limited teachers and resources, forcing children to travel long distances or abandon formal education altogether. Economic opportunities are also scarce. Most Subanen families still depend on subsistence agriculture, planting corn, cassava, and rice on small plots. However, land scarcity and environmental degradation have made farming increasingly difficult. Logging and mining have stripped forests, reducing access to game, wild fruits, and traditional medicines. Many communities report declining yields, worsened by soil erosion and unpredictable weather patterns linked to climate change. Without secure land tenure, Subanen farmers face the constant threat of displacement as commercial interests or migrant settlers expand into their territories. Poverty is compounded by social stigma. In lowland towns and cities, the Subanen are sometimes stereotyped as backward or uncivilized. This discrimination discourages many from openly identifying as Subanen, especially younger generations seeking acceptance in mainstream society. Yet within communities, pride remains strong, reinforced by rituals, oral tradition, and collective memory. The persistence of poverty and marginalization highlights the unfinished business of justice. While laws such as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act exist, implementation remains uneven, and the gap between policy and reality continues to disadvantage the Subanen. Despite these challenges, the Subanen have also made significant strides in education and advocacy. Younger generations are increasingly pursuing higher education, often with the support of scholarships from NGOs, church groups, or government programs. Subanen students become teachers, lawyers, social workers, and community organizers, returning to their villages to support cultural preservation and rights advocacy. These educated youth act as bridges, combining modern skills with ancestral knowledge. Education has also become a site of cultural pride. Alternative learning systems and community-based schools integrate Subanen language, songs, and history into curricula. Children are taught not only mathematics and science, but also the genealogies of their people, the meaning of rituals, and the stories of ancestral heroes. Elders collaborate with teachers to transmit oral traditions, ensuring that modern schooling does not erase indigenous identity. This blending of tradition and modernity has revitalized Subanen pride, encouraging young people to see their culture not as an obstacle, but as a source of strength. Advocacy has expanded from local struggles to national and even international arenas. Subanen leaders participate in conferences on indigenous rights, environmental protection, and cultural preservation. They use platforms such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, to frame their demands within global human rights discourse. Media campaigns, documentaries, and festivals have showcased Subanen culture, challenging stereotypes and building solidarity. Through advocacy, the Subanen have transformed from marginalized voices into active participants shaping their future. Perhaps the most remarkable quality of the Subanen in the contemporary era is their resilience. Despite centuries of colonization, displacement, and marginalization, they remain rooted in their ancestral identity. Rituals such as the Buklog continue to be performed, not only as Thanksgiving, but as declarations of survival. Crafts, music, and dances thrive, sometimes adapted for tourism or advocacy, but always carrying deep cultural meaning. Elders remind communities that to be Subanen is to live in balance with land, spirits, and kin, a philosophy that sustains resilience even amid modern pressures. Visions for the future emphasize land, education, and cultural continuity. Many Subanen advocate for stronger enforcement of ancestral domain rights, ensuring that forests and rivers remain under community control. Others prioritize education, believing that knowledge is the key to resisting exploitation and securing opportunities. Cultural preservation projects, from language documentation to digital archives of chants and rituals, are seen as essential for transmitting identity to younger generations. The Subanen also engage in broader issues, such as climate change and environmental defense. They see themselves as guardians of forests and rivers, not only for their own survival, but for the well-being of the planet. By defending their ancestral lands from mining, logging, and destructive projects, they contribute to global struggles for ecological balance. Their resilience lies not only in survival, but in vision, the determination to shape a future where they are not marginalized relics of the past, but active custodians of culture, land, and life. In this way, the Subanen story continues, a history of endurance, adaptation, and hope. The Subanen identity has endured centuries of upheaval, colonization, land dispossession, modernization, and cultural marginalization. Yet it remains alive and vibrant. At its core, being Subanen means belonging to the land, the rivers, the mountains, and the forests of the Zamboanga Peninsula. This bond is not simply geographical, but spiritual. The Subanen concept of gbansa, Subanon, the Subanen Nation, expresses a collective identity rooted in ancestry, territory, and shared tradition. Unlike modern nation-states, this nation is not defined by borders or armies, but by memory, ritual, and a continuity of lifeways. Cultural continuity is expressed through language, rituals, and oral traditions. Even as many Subanen adopt Visayan, Tagalog, or English for daily interaction, the Subanen language continues to function as the vessel of cultural knowledge. Every myth, chant, and genealogy spoken in Subanen carries ancestral resonance. The Buklog, the epic chants, and agricultural rituals sustain spiritual links to ancestors and deities, reaffirming that human life is inseparable from the cosmos. Despite modernization pressures, these traditions continue, adapting without losing their essence. Identity also endures through kinship and communal values. Subanen families still practice Pentecost, mutual aid, reinforcing solidarity in farming, construction, and rituals. Marriage remains a communal affair, linking families in webs of obligation and trust. Respect for elders ensures that oral knowledge flows across generations. These practices root the Subanen in their heritage, enabling them to withstand external pressures. To be Subanen today is not only to inherit the past, but to actively assert identity in a world that often marginalizes indigenous voices. It is an ongoing act of cultural survival, affirming dignity and pride in the face of adversity. While cultural continuity is strong, the Subanen face pressing challenges in the contemporary world. Land remains the central issue. Despite the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, recognizing ancestral domains, implementation is inconsistent. Mining and logging companies continue to operate in Subanen territories, often with government backing. These industries not only displace communities, but also destroy forests, rivers, and sacred sites. For the Subanen, The fight for ancestral land is not simply political, it is existential. Without land, rituals lose context, language loses meaning, and identity erodes. Poverty and lack of services compound these struggles. Many Subanen communities lack adequate schools, healthcare, and infrastructure. Malnutrition, poor health, and high dropout rates are persistent problems. Climate change adds further pressure, with erratic weather disrupting agriculture and intensifying floods or droughts. Marginalization also persists socially, as discrimination in towns and cities stigmatizes Indigenous identity. Younger Subanen often face the dilemma of hiding their roots for social acceptance or embracing their heritage despite prejudice. Yet the struggle for justice continues. Subanen leaders, activists, and youth advocate for stronger recognition of Indigenous rights, both locally and globally. They participate in forums on climate change, human rights, and cultural preservation, framing their struggles as part of larger global issues. Partnerships with NGOs, churches, and academic institutions have strengthened their capacity to defend land and culture. The resilience of the Subanen is evident in their insistence that despite centuries of neglect, they are not relics of history, but active participants in shaping the present. The struggle for justice is not only about survival, but about securing dignity and self-determination for future generations. The future of the Subanen lies in the balance between preservation and adaptation. Younger generations are increasingly blending tradition with modernity, using digital tools to document oral histories, incorporating Indigenous knowledge into environmental advocacy, and participating in national politics while grounding themselves in cultural values. Subanen youth who become teachers, lawyers, and activists return to their communities, bringing modern skills to defend ancestral rights. Their vision is not to abandon tradition, but to make it relevant in contemporary struggles. Environmental stewardship is central to these visions. The Subanen see themselves as guardians of the Zamboanga Peninsula's ecosystems, protecting forests and rivers not only for their own survival, but for the well-being of the planet. Their rituals, such as the Buklog, embody ecological wisdom, teaching that humans must live in balance with nature. As climate change intensifies, this worldview gains global relevance. The Subanen remind the world that sustainability is not a new concept, but an ancient practice embedded in Indigenous traditions. Cultural renewal is also key. Efforts to preserve the Subanen language, document epics, and revive crafts ensure that identity endures. Festivals are performed not only for outsiders, but as affirmations of pride within communities. Partnerships with universities, NGOs, and cultural organizations expand these efforts, giving the Subanen a platform to share their heritage globally. The future envisioned by the Subanen is one where they are not marginalized tribal minorities, but recognized as equal participants in national and global conversations. Ultimately, the Subanen story is one of resilience. From pre-colonial autonomy to colonial disruption, from marginalization to revitalization, they have endured. Their continuity testifies to the power of culture, memory, and spirituality. As the Subanen move forward, they carry with them a vision rooted in land, guided by ancestors, and sustained by community. In this way, their history is not only their own, but part of the larger human story. A reminder that identity, justice, and survival are inseparable, and that Indigenous voices remain vital to the future of humanity. And so, today we have walked together through the long and powerful history of the Subanen Tribes, from their ancient beginnings to their struggles in the modern world. We learned how they called themselves the gbansa Subanon, united by rivers, valleys, and ancestral memory. We discovered their sacred rituals, their music, their dances, and the role of the Timuay in keeping balance between law and spirit. We saw their resistance to colonization, their suffering under land loss, and their resilience against mining and militarization. And we witnessed how, even today, they continue to fight for their ancestral rights, preserve their identity, and envision a future of justice and cultural pride. The moral of this story is clear. The Subanen remind us that history is not only about empires and wars, but also about the quiet endurance of communities who refuse to disappear. Their survival teaches us the importance of land, language, and culture in defining who we are. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of the Subanen people, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to History Teller YT for more powerful, untold stories of cultures, struggles, and resilience. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and remember, history is alive when we choose to listen.